Welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Jenaé filling in for Vinnie. The subject of our investigation is Lori Daybell, a convicted child killer who is on trial again, and she's defending herself against accusations she conspired to kill her fourth husband, Charles Vallow. Here's the story. Lori Vallow Daybell married Charles Vallow in 2006, and their relationship initially appeared stable. In 2013, they adopted Charles's great-nephew, Joshua J.J. Vallow, who was diagnosed with autism. But by early 2019, their relationship deteriorated as Lori became increasingly immersed in apocalyptic beliefs, claiming to be a divine figure tasked with preparing for Christ's return. She accused Charles of being possessed by a dark spirit named Ned Schneider and threatened to kill him. Fearing for his safety, Charles looked into filing for a divorce and getting a protective order, citing Lori's erratic behavior and threats. On July 11, 2019, Charles was shot to death by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, this during a confrontation at Lori's Arizona home. Cox claimed self-defense, but prosecutors allege that Lori conspired in the killing to obtain Charles's life insurance and pursue a relationship with Chad Daybell, whom she married months later. Lori is on trial in Arizona for conspiracy to commit murder in Charles's death, and she's representing herself in court. And a jury is going to have to decide, was this self-defense? Did Alex Cox fear for his life when he fired those two shots into Charles's body? One focus of this trial has been Charles's cell phone. Lori had it when her brother Alex shot him. Here's Lori in her interview with police after everything happened in Arizona.
He came back in and his phone was on the counter and I had his phone. And he was like, give me my phone. And I was like, why don't you show me your text that you've been texting, blah, blah, blah. You know, whatever, because he's like acting really weird, like he's plotting something. He came back in and his phone was on the counter and I had his phone. And he was like, give me my phone. And I was like, why don't you show me your text that you've been texting, blah, blah, blah. You know, whatever, because he's like acting really weird, like he's plotting something. My brother had like stepped back, I guess, and then Charles was coming with me at the back and yelling at me to give him his phone still, because I had it in my hand. It was all really quickly. And then when I went around kind of in the circle, then my brother was there.
But why did she have that cell phone? Was she really interested in what Charles was texting, or was she trying to rile him up in order to start an argument? So that brings us to our first question in our investigation. Did Lori instigate the fight that ended with Charles Vallow dead? Joining us, Lori Vallow Daybell's cousin and author of I Walked Through Fire to Get Here, and host of the podcast, The Midlife Revolution. We have Megan Connor, and retired police officer, police commander, religious cult expert, and host of Profiling Evil podcast, also the author of the book Deceived. Mike King is with us. Good to have you both on to talk about this case and this trial. Megan, I want to start with you for a little background. Was Lori known to have fights with Charles or with people in her personal life?
Well, I wasn't really privy to Lori and Charles's personal relationship, but in my experience with Lori, she was adept at starting a fight when she needed to, and to get her point across or to get her way, she was not above starting problems and picking fights with people just to, you know, get what she wanted, basically.
Mike King, do you think she instigated the fight in this case?
You know, I really don't know, Julia. The thing that I do think is important to consider, though, are the facts that we do know there. And that was that it appears that he was lured into that residence to pick up JJ, go to school. But for some reason, Lori felt concerned enough that she had Alex there, at least according to her testimony, and that he was there to protect her. So I find it really interesting that she would go and grab his phone, knowing that that would further enrage him if he was that frightening and she was really concerned about him. So I think it's more important at this point, rather than to kind of guess about whether she instigated this thing, is to whether she really was part of planning this thing. And it really points to the fact that there was planning to get him into that residence, to get him there at that early morning hour, to miraculously have Alex there with a weapon, and be able to control that scene like that.
Let's take a listen to what a detective had to say. This is a detective that interviewed Lori, so Lori would have been talking to this detective about the timeline of events and how important that phone was in this argument.
Did Lori ever tell you during your interview that Charles started this argument?
No.
During your interview of Lori Vallow, was it always her saying that it was her that started this argument because she would not give Charles back his phone?
Correct.
So she told you that she was afraid of Charles coming over, invited her brother over to protect her, and then she started a fight by refusing to give Charles back his phone.
Correct.
Megan, you've been inside of this courtroom watching testimony, so you're not only connected by relation to this case, but also just being there, being a trial watcher. When you look at how Lori responded to the person that perhaps Charles would have been texting, we don't know, but we know that the woman he had a date with the night before may have sent him a text the next day. Do you think it's possible that she really did want to see what was going on his phone?
Well, yes, I think she had already put out this narrative that Charles was having an affair. She had asked family members not to talk to him anymore, just isolating him to himself. And I think she was really curious about what was being said about her on the phone. If you listen to a lot of her testimony in court and a lot of the questions that she asks the witnesses, many of them are simply her trying to find out what people are saying about her. And so I think she did want to know. I think she wanted to read those text messages. But I agree with Mike. It's strong evidence that they did lure Charles into the house and that they set this up in advance.
Because Mike, when Charles was at the house, let's talk about why his phone would have been very important to him. This wasn't a home where he lived. This wasn't a home where he just could have been without his phone for a long period of time. What was he there for and where was he trying to go?
Yeah, I think this is really important because he just left his hotel room. He drove over to take JJ to school. That was the whole guys that put him there at that home that early in the morning. And we heard from testimony from Adam that there was a real concern about her mental state, and there was actually a text just moments before he walked through the door saying, hey, I'm feeling really unsure about things because now I'm learning that Alex is there and this could be a setup of some kind. So he's walking in, his phone is his lifeline for the outside world, and all of a sudden it's taken from him. And if we were to just go on face value with what Lori's saying about taking that phone, I agree with Megan that she's too transparent. I think, though, if she would have really known he was having an affair, she would have been shouting from the rooftops who it was and what was going on, and not be surprised by this. And most importantly, I guess the thing that really keeps coming back to me and troubling me is that when the detective finally gets access to that phone and takes it from Lori and Ty Lee, she says, what's the access code? And they give it to her. So she doesn't need to say to Charles, hey, show me what's on the phone. That's just a bunch of malarkey.
And when you mention that, Mike, a follow-up, because if she has the access code, that means she can get into this phone. We know there were issues with her taking money out of the joint accounts that Charles went to police and authorities over. So if she's got that phone, she may have access to a lot more than just who he was texting.
Yeah, and when we start seeing those GPS breadcrumbs that the detective talks about later in the day, we don't know that she wasn't tracking every footstep that he was taking along the way as well. And so I hope that there's a little more information that comes out, or a little more that's exposed as this thing goes forward. But again, I keep going back to this, points more and more to the fact that this was pre-planned and he was lured to that home. And whether this was a pre-planned murder or a pre-planned confrontation, there was planning in the beginning stages.
Megan, this was not one-sided. We're leaving out the part that even if Lori was upset about an affair, was making hay about these text messages, she was simultaneously having an affair with Chad Daybell at the same time as this. So how do you process that when you're hearing her come after someone that may have been dating Charles on the stand, and also years ago in this incident trying to get a cell phone so she can see who he was texting?
Yeah, so this is what I like to call you spot it, you got it disease. People with narcissistic traits tend to accuse other people of the very things that they are doing. And that generally turned out to be true. If Lori was accusing someone else of doing something, it was actually her. Later on, when there's a welfare check in Idaho, she tells investigators that her brother was trying to kill her for her $2 million life insurance policy. Well, we know that by this time, she and Alex had already killed Charles for his life insurance policy. So it's a pattern with her where she accuses people of things that she herself is doing.
Megan and Michael are going to be staying with us. We have a lot more to talk about here on VPI. When we come back, we are going to look at where Lori was when Charles was shot.
Lori Daybell.
Already convicted for the murders of her children.
Doomsday cult mom is now lawyer Lori.
She's representing herself.
On charges of conspiring to murder her fourth husband.
She said, I can murder you now.
She really thinks she's equipped to try this case.
She appears very sure of herself.
I have real trial experience.
It's going to be a strange trial. We'll see how it plays out.
The Cult Mom Conspiracy Trial. Live coverage weekday mornings. Only on Court TV.
We just moved in here.
Gotcha. How long have you guys lived here?
Sorry?
How long have you lived here?
Like 3 weeks.
Oh, geez. Yeah, okay.
That's why the neighbors took us.
Gotcha.
Like, hi, neighbor, sorry.
That was Lori Vallow Daybell on police body camera speaking to an officer shortly after the death of her fourth husband, Charles Vallow. She's joking around about how she had just moved in and her neighbors. She's going to know that they will see all of these lights outside, the police, the investigation into a death. Later, she described the killing to a police detective in the interview where she says she was there and heard the shots, but that Alex was just out of view and that she didn't see the shots fired.
We were all right there in that room except for the kids had been outside by that time, and I heard the gunshot. And
So you heard the shot? Did you actually see the shot, or did you just hear it?
I had gone around to the kitchen to get away from him, and so back around. So I don't know if he went in the house.
I didn't, so I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage.
Yeah, so I didn't see the shot. I heard it, and then I came back around and I saw that he was on the ground. I feel like I was there because I was right there, and like a second later, I just went around the kitchen to get away from him.
So that was Lori's version of events shortly after Charles's murder, a couple of hours after that happened at her Arizona home. So it leads us to our next question, because it's important to figure out where exactly was Lori when Charles was shot? What has she said, and what does the evidence say? Still with us, Megan Connor and Mike King. Mike, let me start with you. Where exactly was Lori during all of this, and do we know?
Well, I think the evidence is pointing out that she was there when the first shot rang out. The question is, was she there when that second shot, which basically was an execution shot, even though it was through the abdomen, was fired? And this is what I find so interesting, because she says that she hears the first shot. She walks by Charles lying on the ground and out the door and climbs in the car. Doesn't call 911, doesn't do anything else. But what she does is admits that I was there when that first round was fired. Question is, was she there when the second one was shot?
Yeah, Megan, that's a hard pill to swallow when you hear that she may have gone back, saw Charles on the ground, but left.
Yeah, it sounds to me, of course, like this was planned and that she planned to leave. And as we heard her tell the detective in that interview just now, she heard the shot. She keeps referring to the single shot. So I don't think that she was there for the second shot. And it's kind of speculation at this point what happened, because as we know, Lori is the only one that was there that morning who's still alive.
Yeah, let's listen to what she said in her opening statements, because it seemed like she had very careful words when talking about exactly how this killing played out. Listen to how she describes the order of events.
The evidence will show that at some point while I was running away from Charles, who was chasing me with a bat, that Alex apparently retrieved his gun. The evidence will show that I ran outside to the children and that Alex shot Charles in self-defense. The evidence will show that Tylee and I had both run outside without shoes.
Ran without shoes and then had to buy flip-flops at Walgreens. Mike King, let's first talk about how she said it, because she didn't say in her opening statement that she heard a shot. She didn't say that she saw anything. She didn't say that she went back and saw Charles on the ground. She said that she got out of there. Why is it important to know exactly where she was? How does that help the prosecution?
Well, I think, number one, this is going to help because they're going to be able to impeach her on her own testimony, which is going to be really important. And then they're going to be able to say, look, you've come up with a bunch of different scenarios as this thing has gone on. This particular instance, she's saying, hey, I had the phone. I went into the kitchen to kind of run around that little corner and come back out the other way. She doesn't say he was chasing her, although in one version she does. And at that point, she sees Alex coming down the hallway and coming out to confront Charles. Again, all of that really becomes kind of intriguing when you look at the layout of that house. Then she has to walk past him and get out the door. And I guess, Julia, even for me, even if she wasn't there on the first shot, she and Tylee both indicate in other testimony that they heard the shot. And yet they get in the car and they go get breakfast. They go to a store. They have a carload of mobile phones because they've taken his and their own. And she still makes no 911 calls.
Well, let's talk about that, because prosecution made it very clear that there was a delay in the timing for anyone to call 911, not Alex Cox, who fired the shot, or Lori Daybell, who presumably went back inside that home and at least saw her husband there on the ground. But the detective said when they were questioning the witnesses based on the 911 call, they had some really alarming details about what the evidence shows.
So ultimately, what you determined was that the timeline of Lori Vallow leaving when the 911 call was and returning back was not accurate.
Yes, as I understood, based on, again, the multiple different ways now that we're able to corroborate location not only of devices that are relevant, because we knew at this point that she had Charles's phone. We knew numbers for her phones. We have video of her at various places. It led to the inescapable conclusion that either the shooting did not happen that close in time to the 911 call, or that she wasn't there for the shooting. I could not see a third way of interpreting that data.
Over 40 minutes before anyone called 911. Mike King, if you're investigating this case, what does that tell you when you've got that much time after someone calls, after a shooting and a killing, presumed killing, because even Alex Cox at the time believed that there was nothing he could do to save Charles Vallow?
Exactly, and I think this is really going to be a nail in the coffin, because what we see here now is we have physical forensics that show us the liver mortis and the rigor mortis and all of the signs of showing that body, how long that body has been down on the ground. But we have a digital footprint now that not only impeaches some of the things that Lori's saying, but it also identifies that Charles's phone leaves the residence with Lori's phone, which leaves the residence, and that they're completely away. And if her testimony that I heard the shot is true, then it's 30 minutes or so before that 911 call is made, which gives you a whole lot of time to do some staging.
Megan, I know you've been there inside of the courtroom for various parts of this trial. Have you been learning anything new with the evidence coming out? I know you know a lot about this case going into it. You followed the Idaho trial for Lori Daybell, where she was found guilty in the murder of her children and her fifth husband's wife. But is there anything that's coming out now that is surprising you?
Well, I think what we heard today, this is some new information that we've gotten about where the cell phones traveled and how far they traveled. One really telling thing that I didn't know previously, maybe other people did, was that the last text that was sent to Charles Vallow was then later subsequently read after his death, around 12:30 in the afternoon or so. And then today we heard evidence that said that Lori and Alex were at Alex's residence with Charles's cell phones for about 2 hours before they turned it over to police. So those are some of the things that I've learned that are new that I think are really pivotal to proving that this was premeditated.
Mike King, you are the expert on profiling evil and cults. Do you think that their plan needed to involve Lori Vallow being there but not witnessing the shooting?
Wow, that's interesting because that certainly sets Alex up for the responsibility for everything and does what we've seen Lori do over and again, which is stay one step away. We see this often in cult leaders where they really aren't the ones I worry about the most, Julia. It's usually the number 2 or the number 3 that's really trying to prove their allegiance. And as one serial killer told me one time, who was a religious zealot, he said his brother was the voice of God, but he got to be the arm of God. And in this particular case, Alex Cox was the arm of God, and that God was whatever God Lori Vallow listens to.
Mike King, thank you so much for being with us. Megan Connor, you're going to stick around because we have a lot more to talk about in this case. The next question, why isn't Chad Daybell charged in all of this? Welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Julia Jenaé, filling in for Vinnie tonight. We are continuing our investigation of a woman who is convicted of killing both of her children. And she has a latest murder trial where she's now being accused of taking the life of her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, to be with her 5th husband, Chad Daybell, and to try and collect a $1 million life insurance policy. Here's Lori Daybell's story. Lori Daybell appears to have committed not only crimes she's already been convicted of, but those she's also now on trial for, all for the sake of money, power, and sex. She stood to inherit money from her husband Charles's life insurance after his death. But before he was shot to death by Lori's brother Alex, he went behind her back and changed his beneficiary to his sister. Charles's death did open the door for Lori to marry the so-called doomsday prophet, Chad Daybell. He's already in prison for the murders of his first wife, Tammy, and Lori's children, JJ and Tylee. In the wake of Charles's death, Lori and Chad's bond deepened, their union sealed in marriage just weeks after Chad's first wife died under mysterious circumstances. This whirlwind of events unveiled a narrative steeped in betrayal, fanaticism, and a chilling disregard for life, leaving Charles, 2 children, and Chad's wife dead, and Lori inside a courtroom facing yet another murder trial where she's representing herself. Lori Daybell said it herself in her opening statements in a tone that criticized the prosecution's case, saying that she's the only one who's been charged in Charles Vallow's death. Now, her brother, Alex, the trigger man, he can't face charges because he's dead. But investigators did want to charge another person in addition to Lori, and that's Chad Daybell, her 5th husband, the one she's married to now. They believe there's evidence to show that he knew Lori was planning to have Charles murdered and that he was the one who was manipulating everything. And that includes texts between Lori and Chad after the killing about Charles's life insurance policy. Let's take a look, because these are from July 18th, 2019. This is after the death of Charles Vallow, where Lori says to Chad, "I just got the letter from the insurance company saying I'm not the beneficiary. It's a spear through my heart. Who do you think it changed to?" Brandon, or probably Kay? He left nothing for JJ. Chad replies, it will be interesting if it got changed after he had 2 bullets in his chest. Later, Lori says to him, I talked to the insurance company. He changed it in March. Ned before we got rid of him. Now, Ned there is referring to Charles. It's a name that Chad and Lori used to say that Charles was no longer in his body and that evil spirits had taken over his body. That brings us to the next question in our investigation. Why isn't this man, Chad Daybell, charged in Arizona with the death of Charles Vallow? Let's bring back in Lori Vallow Daybell's cousin, author of I Walked Through Fire to Get Here and host of the podcast The Midlife Revolution. Megan Connor is with us, and host of the true crime podcast Pretty Lies and Alibis. She also knows many people close to the case and has been in the courtroom for this trial. Gigi McKelvey is here too. Both of our guests have this inside knowledge, so I'm so glad to speak with you about this one. Gigi, let me start with you. Do we know why prosecutors declined to charge Chad Daybell in Arizona?
They said that there was an unreasonable likelihood of a conviction. And I really disagree with that. Just knowing what I know about the case, seeing these text messages, I think you could take this right now to a grand jury and get an indictment and just go on a circumstantial case and convict that man. Because, you know, you have to think, he called the mortuary to get prices to have Charles cremated and shipped to Louisiana, saying that it was his uncle, Myron Daybell. I mean, I think there is plenty there to charge Chad. And just to point out, there is no statute of limitations here in Arizona. So who knows, maybe in the future, he will face charges for Charles's murder.
That's a good point. Gigi, we have that call. Let's listen to what Chad Daybell said, where he's calling a funeral home. He's asking about costs. This is before and after the death of Charles Vallow.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm assisting with their calls. How can I help you today?
We just had a death in the family, and we really don't want anything but a cremation, and then to send the cremains to a family in Louisiana.
What is your name, please?
It is Chad Daybell.
How do you spell the last name, please?
D-A-B-A-L, Daybell.
How are you related to the person who passed?
I'm his nephew.
What is your uncle's name for reference, please?
He is John Daybell.
And last name?
Well, D-A-B-A-L.
Okay.
The same. John.
He changes about 2 letters in his name when he's talking to someone, trying to be discreet, we assume. Megan, your reaction to finding out that Chad Daybell would not be facing any charges at this point for the death of Charles?
Well, unfortunately, I've learned through this process a little bit of how the court system works and how law enforcement works. And I know that a lot of times they have to go with that likelihood of conviction. If they're going to spend state time and resources on prosecuting a case, they have to reasonably think that they're going to get a conviction. I know there's a lot of compelling evidence. I agree with Gigi on that one. But also, Chad is serving a life sentence, he's on death row in Idaho. And he's also, I believe, if I remember correctly, he still is sort of in the appeals process. So I don't know how logistically possible it would be to charge him at this point.
Gigi, let's talk about the difference between that Idaho case and this one. When you think about the evidence that there was in Idaho against Chad, we know in that trial, Alex was still considered the one who actually carried out these killings, but it was behind the scenes that we learned a lot more about what was going on. How do you think that compares to what we have in Charles's case?
There was just a lot more evidence digitally in the Idaho case, especially with Alex Cox having his phone on his person when he's out helping Chad bury these kids. With this case, really, it comes down to text messages where they're saying it was probably Ned who changed the beneficiary before we got rid of him. That was between Lori and Alex. Chad made a couple of comments about, maybe there's no way he could have changed it after he had 2 bullets in the chest. But unfortunately, that's not a crime. to say something vile like that. So I think between Lori and Alex, you have more of the Ned before we got rid of him, which is a pretty powerful statement that leans towards guilt, to where you just have Chad not being sympathetic at all and saying things that are just rude. So maybe that's it, but still, all of these deaths are so connected that to me, if you're going to charge one in any of these cases, they all need to be charged because they were all in on it from January of 2019, really when this all just started going at breakneck speed towards disaster.
Yeah, Gigi, I'm recalling in the Idaho case, there was a lot of emphasis on Chad Daybell being the one to name who was the evil spirit, who had a zombie or had turned into a zombie. And that was part of the prosecution's case, that he was involved. He was the one identifying when someone turned dark. But if we don't have that here, do you think this actually makes the case a little bit more tricky for prosecutors when you have just Lori Daybell on trial and no mention of what happened in Idaho?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easier because that was his wife. And so it looks worse if you have $1 million life insurance policy at play to where Chad was in Idaho when it happened. Chad was Googling Ned Schneider and all of this stuff very early on, I believe as early as January, just a couple of months after he and Lori met. Lori very quickly leaves Charles. Chad starting all this research on the names that we know Charles was called as this dark entity. But it is a very different world between 3 murder victims and Charles, in that this was very early on in the case. He was the first victim. And I just think up there, especially with Alex not being careful with his phone, they were able to nail them down a lot finer there than Chad here, where right now we just have Chad doing some really slimy stuff, but it's not a crime to be a jerk.
And I'm glad you pointed that out. Charles Vallow, he was the first victim in this conspiracy, something this jury is not really hearing because they can only really focus on Charles Vallow's death. But let's look back at Idaho when the attorney who was representing Chad Daybell laid out a pretty passionate defense regarding anything involving Charles Vallow's death as it relates to Chad.
Fact. Chad Daybell was not involved with Charles Vallow. Fact. Chad Daybell is not implicated with Brandon Boudreaux. Fact. Chad Daybell espoused religious beliefs. Where's the agreement? Where is the agreement? It's not there.
Megan, can you talk about the difference between the Idaho case as it relates to Chad and the Arizona one and what you think you would want to see happen in the future in this case?
Well, first, I'm just distracted by John Pryor reminding me so much of the Dwight Schrute character from The Office with his fact and fact. The Idaho case was so different in so many ways. I think there was an overwhelming amount of evidence to go through. The trial lasted much longer than this one is taking so far. And I think that it was a lot easier for the jury, at least in my opinion, watching it. It was easier for the jury to connect the dots. I think the prosecutors learned some things from Lori's first trial. They talked to the jurors and found out what would have been more helpful. And I think it was more of a narrative telling. It was easier for the juries to put that into a story. I'm really hoping that they're going to do that here in Arizona.
Megan, Connor, thanks so much for being with us. I know you're going to stick around. Gigi McKelvey, thank you for being with us. More to come on the Lori Daybell case. The next question is, was this about money, power, or sex?
Money, power, and sex.
Sex, money, and power.
I prayed to God, please don't let it happen.
How can we believe you? On the next Interview with a Killer.
The entire family was slaughtered, all choked to death by that smoke and terror.
I tried to get them out. If I could give my life for this, I would. I wish to God it had never happened.
That's not really how God works, is it?
Interview with a Killer. New episode, Sunday at 8 on Court TV.
She's lost her mind. I don't know how else to say it. We're LDS. She thinks she's a resurrected being in a a God and remember the 144,000. She's come. Jesus is coming next year.
And two others.
Threatened me, murder me, kill me.
She threatened to murder you?
Money, power, and sex. We've heard those three words a lot in the tragic saga of Chad and Lori Daybell. Prosecutors argue that it's those three things that motivated the entire series of events that led to multiple murders. Here's a prosecutor from Lori's first trial in Idaho.
Money, power, and sex. That's what this case is about. The defendant, Lori Vallow Daybell, used money, power, and sex, or the promise of those things, to get what she wanted.
We know prosecutors don't have to give a motive, but in Idaho, the opening statement and throughout the case, we heard those buzzwords, money, power, and sex. And that resulted in a conviction of Lori Daybell. Now she's on trial again for another murder, the murder of her husband, her fourth husband, Charles. And it leads us to our next question. Was all of this more about the money, the power, or the sex for Lori Daybell? Let's bring in our guests who are standing by. Still with us, Megan Connor, and joining us, clinical and forensic neuropsychologist, expert in conducting forensic evaluations, and author of the book, The New Rules of Attachment, Dr. Judy Ho is with us. Dr. Ho, based on what you have seen from Lori Daybell and everything we know about her background, what do you think was the biggest motivator for her?
Well, I think it's very interesting, as you were talking about, Julia, this message repeated over and over again, that there are these external factors that Lori's really after that motivated these crimes or these alleged crimes. But I think that there's so much to it than really we can say we could understand. I mean, first of all, some of Lori's actions, even in court, even her decision to represent herself, I think that that would speak to the prosecution's claims that there's something here where she wants the power. She even wants the power of representing herself, though it may not be the best idea in a case this complicated. But of course, the religious backdrop, these ideas that she was telling her friends and other people close to her, that she didn't trust the people she was with anymore, that she thought that they were being possessed. This is a really big part of the case, I think, because was she actually in a right state of mind? Was she having some kind of psychotic belief that needs to be dealt with and evaluated? And we haven't seen enough evidence about that.
Megan Connor, this is your cousin. This is someone you knew, especially more so when she was younger. What do you think was her biggest motivator in these three motives that prosecutions have given?
Well, I think if we can shift power just a little bit and think about it as control, I think there's a lot of evidence for that. And just like Dr. Ho mentioned there, I think that she wants to be in control of the courtroom. She wants to represent herself. And I think that Chad gave her an opportunity to be in control of part of his little religious club. And so I think all of those factors combined together for Lori, whether it's money or sex, it's all about control.
And let's listen back to that, because the prosecution in this trial, the one that's going on in Arizona, talked about motive, not the same buzzwords as we saw in Idaho, but certainly describing what the motive was for Lori Daybell.
In July of 2019, Lori Vallow wanted to be Lori Daybell, wife of Chad Daybell. And in July of 2019, Lori Vallow wanted to keep the same lifestyle that she had with Charles. And she could get all of this if Charles was dead. She could marry Chad Daybell and become Lori Daybell. She would get a $1 million life insurance policy from Charles Vallow. She would get Social Security for herself and their son, JJ, as a child of a dead spouse. And all of this would be true if Charles Vallow was dead. As we go through this trial, you'll be provided with phone calls, emails, text messages, and hear testimony that lays out the motive for this murder: money and Chad Daybell.
Dr. Ho, we're hearing a lot about the money there. Really that she was setting up this life for herself with Chad, so she wasn't throwing caution to the wind. She had a lot of time to think about, what am I going to need in the future? What are your thoughts on this idea that perhaps Lori Daybell has had a break from reality, that she's delusional? There was even a time that she wasn't competent to stand trial for a period, and then she became competent to stand trial. Your thoughts on what we're seeing while she's representing herself now?
Well, I think that oftentimes people have a misunderstanding that if somebody is, for some reason, suffering from delusions, that they can't carry out other activities. I mean, it really just depends on the quality of the delusions, exactly what condition they may or may not have that's leading to those delusions. Oftentimes, they can actually have a very streamlined approach to carrying out daily activities and still plan ahead and actually still have some executive function. So I think that this is what we're seeing. There were times when she may not have been competent, but during the times where she may have been planning this murder, was she able to know right from wrong? Was she able to say, yes, I'm enacting a plan to secure my future? If the prosecution can prove that, then I think that issue of whether or not this psychotic illness is even part of it could be less of the decision for the jury, and more so that she knew what she was doing and did it anyway, even if she had some delusional beliefs as well.
Megan, did you ever see a shift or hear about a shift for Lori at any point in her life where perhaps she seemed like a normal member of the family and then started to espouse these beliefs that she was a translated being?
Well, she definitely did get really into near-death experience books, and especially the book Visions of Glory back in 2013, 2014. And I think that's what sort of started her down what Judge Boyce called a delusional religious rabbit hole. And I think she's still there. But we do see her laughing and smiling in court. We see her somewhat functional as an attorney. And so I think the hard thing for a lot of us is to see Lori acting like everything's normal with absolutely no acknowledgement of what she's done or what she's been convicted of, just pretending to be a lawyer in court. So there's obviously part of that delusion is that she really has done all of this at the behest of whatever religious beliefs that she has. I really think she does believe that she hasn't done anything wrong in this case.
And that's an interesting thing to watch, Dr. Ho, as to whether or not she has ignored something to the point that she still tells her son on phone calls that this didn't happen, that this doesn't exist, even though we know now she's been convicted of it. Do you think there'll ever be a point where she will admit to what has happened?
Well, absolutely, Julia. I think that there's going to be a point where at some point she's going to have some recognition, but it probably will be so brief, we don't even know if anybody's going to be there to capture it. It's very possible that for the most part, she's going to carry on with these ideas. Megan gave some really good examples of them, where essentially she feels self-righteous in a way, that there's a bigger, grander purpose in her life, and she's just carrying out those activities. And so even if at some point she might recognize, well, yeah, this is a crime according to our legal system, she may say, but there was a greater good here. There was a greater purpose that transcends our laws. There's a possibility that that might be part of her thinking and her justification.
You know, we expected to hear perhaps more of that during the trial, but so far we haven't heard her talk a lot about her beliefs, talk about what she believed about herself and perhaps still does. She really has been keeping it to a litigation Lori is what we're seeing play out, but really fascinating analysis from you both. Thank you, Megan Connor and Dr. Judy Ho, for sharing your time with us. You know, whatever Lori's motive is, it's her mentality that's most disturbing. And the victim in this most recent trial, Charles Vallow, he recognized the dark shift in his wife. And by all accounts, he did everything right to sound the alarm. He told family members, he told her family, he told authorities, but it wasn't enough to stop all of the deaths that would come. Charles Vallow was the first victim in this series of killings. And if someone had been able to stop Lori Daybell then, it could have meant a whole different story. Even if she's already sentenced to life in her last trial, this trial acknowledges Charles as a victim and an advocate against evil. That's it for Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Julia Jenaé. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.